That's Esther and Mordechai writing the Megillah. Hi, it's David Ostriker. We're here in Carmiel, 24 hours before the beginning of Purim. Today's shir I want to dedicate to three people: Leah bat Esther, Mordechai ben Moshe, Meir ben Avraham, and really to the entire Sinsovsky families, who we miss very much at this time of year, as well as many of our friends and family in Toronto, for whom we for years shared Megillah reading and Sudas Megillah, Sudas Purim. This year we will miss them very much, although I must say we're very happy here in Carmiel as well. There's a buzzsaw behind me. Tradition has it that these days that a platform was being made on which to hang Haman. Maybe they do this in Carmiel, I don't know. But you'll have to forgive the noise. I'm sorry about the background noise, but this is the reality of life here pre-Purim. I don't think they're building a sukkah. So I want to talk about the Megillah and Purim because it really is a very unique element in the Jewish world, in our religious life. There are many, many halachas about Purim that are very hard to understand. We'll go over them in a second. And the whole idea of Megillah Esther is a very strange concept and not really part of what we normally have from our prophets or from our sages. What am I talking about? You know that the Megillah can be written in virtually any language from a halachic point of view. Now, we don't do it because there are some words that are not translatable, and Chazal held that you should not write a Megillah in two languages. So if you wrote it in English, you would still have to put in three words. I don't want to go into the details of them right now, that were in Hebrew because they can't be translated. So that means you'd be writing the Megillah in two languages, which is really a big b'diavad, a thing that we should try to avoid if at all possible. But barring that, language was not an issue. As you know, there is a halacha that the Torah could be written in Greek, but it never is. And there's virtually no other explanation. And there is no book of Jewish canon in which we say it can be written and read in any language. That is from the bima, from the leader of the congregation. The Mechaber, Rav Yosef Karo, held that you could have a minyan made of women for Megillah reading. The Ramah differed, and there's a machlokes about it, a discussion about it. Again, but this is not something that exists for, say, Torah reading, or virtually any other place where a minyan is required. Why would that be? The Megillah doesn't mention God's name, and that is one of the biggest questions that we have. How can you write a holy book in which God is the mover and shaker of all events in the book, but he's not credited with it? His name never appears. What's the reason? Well, one of the reasons given is God is working behind the scenes, so we don't want to make it clear. Another reason is the name king is mentioned many, many times in the Megillah, and when it is a reference specifically to King Achashverosh, it says it, but when it says the king, right, then we have a tradition that could refer, in fact, to God himself. Right? There's some other things in the Megillah that is strange. What book do we read twice as a requirement? None. None. Right? No Megillah, no Navi, We don't have to read it twice. You have to read it once, right? Megillah you have to hear night and day. Tomorrow night and the following morning. Right? Another thing, a Megillah that is incomplete, right, is still kosher if the Baal Koreh, the person reading it, fills in the missing few words Baal Peh, by heart. And yet, if you miss hearing one word of the Megillah, you haven't fulfilled the mitzvah. So the actual document could be missing words, but the listener must hear every word or read along at any missing words in case kids make too much noise or whatever, right? But if a word is missing, he has not fulfilled. Every word must be heard. Right? That doesn't happen anywhere else except Parsha Zachor, which is connected to Purim as well. We read it last Shabbos. In the Megillah, in Purim, there are 4 mitzvahs. Right? Hear the Megillah twice. Give gifts to the poor, Matanos Avayim. Right? Sholach manot, send gifts to friends and loved ones, family. Right? And sit together for a Purim feast. Right? And by the way, the best way to fulfill the mitzvah of hearing the Megillah is in the largest group possible. Now, the only exception to that rule is if you're in such a large group that you won't hear every word, then it's better to be in a smaller group where you hear the words. But generally, the gathering together of Jews for this is very, very important. It specifically says that the larger the number, the greater the glory of the king. Let's look at some of these things and see how they come together. Now remember, the authors of the Megillah, according to the Megillah itself, are Mordechai and Esther. Mordechai and Esther. In our story in the Megillah, I'm assuming that most of you know the story of Purim. And there's a moment in the story that is very perplexing. There are many moments. But one of them is when Mordechai realizes what Haman has planned, the extinction of every Jew in the Persian Empire, which was virtually all Jews in the world. He sends a message to the queen, Esther, whatever his relationship is, it's a very close relationship, with these instructions. Let me read it to you. I'm going to just read the English for the sake of time. Okay. He instructed her, this was by a letter, he instructed her to come before the king and to appeal to him and to plead with him for her people. She responded, all the king's servants and even the people of the king's provinces know that if any man or woman who is not summoned comes into the king's inner courtyard, the law is unequivocal, a penalty of death. By the way, remember, the king's previous wife, Vashti, in our story, was killed because she didn't come when she was summoned. So it's very dangerous to play with the rules of the king. Only if the king extends his golden scepter to him will his life be spared. But I, writes Esther, but I have not been summoned to come to the king for 30 days. When the message came to Mordechai about Esther's response, he sent back another message. He instructed her quite directly, don't imagine that you alone, out of all the Jews, will escape by being in the king's palace. Actually, if you stay quiet now, the Jews will find relief and safety through a different route, while you and your father's household will be destroyed. Harsh words. And then he adds, And who knows? Perhaps becoming the queen, the monarchy, came your way precisely for this moment. Now, I'm just going to take a little path to the side here. Is we should know when we're confronted with difficulties, with challenges, that perhaps we're confronted for just this moment to take a position, to do the right thing. We should always have that in mind. These words of Mordechai to Esther speak to every one of us, sometimes every day. But I have a question on it. Esther is being asked to go to the king, and if the king does not raise his scepter, then that is capital punishment. She will be killed, as was Vashti before her. And yet, Mordechai says, if you don't go, your mission, the mission of saving the Jews, will still be fulfilled. The Jews will be saved, but you'll be disgraced. You and your family. Seems unfair. If you know the Jews are going to be saved, whether by miracle or some other process, why would you ask this woman who you care so much about to take her life in her hands? Decent question. Let's look a moment at who Mordechai himself was. We think of him as a very pious, revered person. He was actually, he caused a lot of trouble for the Jews. He wasn't very cooperative with the host nation. And yet, by the way, he had a court position. He had access to the palace at will, as we know from the story itself. Book of Esther tells us that Mordechai was a Benjamite who had been exiled from Jerusalem with the exile of Yechoniah, the king of Judah. According to the Talmudic sage Rava, however, Mordechai actually joined the exile voluntarily so that he could remain with the scholars. The Jews were exiled by the Assyrians, by the Babylonians, and eventually in Persia as well, or to Persia as well, in stages. And the first stage was the elite, the great scholars, the king, etc., were taken first to Babylon by Nebuchadnezzar. This was actually fortuitous in a sense, because they built a structure there for when the rest of the exiles arrived. They didn't come to a place that was without learning, without Jewish structure. They came to a structured environment that had been built by the elite in the first part of the exile. One could assume that he was a youth at the time of the exile, as the events in the Purim story take place at the end of the exile 70-some-odd years later. In the interim, traditional sources record that Mordechai was one of those who joined Ezra and Nehemiah, returning to Jerusalem to begin the building of the temple. When the nations, it seems he went back and forth from Jerusalem to Babylon or to Persia, at least once or maybe more. When the nations who had moved into Judea's territory quarreled with the Jews, it was Mordechai who was sent back to Shushan, to Persia, to negotiate with the king. It appears Mordechai remained in Shushan and became one of the members of the Sanhedrin. That's why he spoke 70 languages and knew what Bigsan and Teresh were saying. There are two other interesting biographical facts about Mordechai. One is he's descended from King Shaul as a Benjamite, who was the first king. And second was that after the overthrow of Haman, he becomes the prime minister. So just as Esther remains the empress and queen after our story, which is a tragedy really for her, so it is that Mordechai assumes he's a member of the Sanhedrin, the great Supreme Court in every sense of the word of the Jewish people. but he's also taken on a secular job as the first minister of the Persian Empire under Achashverosh. So Mordechai is a pious, learned Jew, but he's also a very, very effective and savvy politician. And his role guiding Esther in the early stages, although Esther takes control later on of the situation, and his role in dealing with the king, the emperor, and Haman is that of a very, very sharp and savvy politician, as well as a very devoted servant of God. Now, let's look a little bit further on in this. I want to discuss a little bit about where I'm going. Rabbi Karapkin at the Bayat in Toronto sent out a Purim note that when you read it, you'll come to understand something very essential. And all of these things will fall into place, perhaps, for you as we examine it. He writes, "Today I quoted an astounding statement from Rav Sadia Gaon." Sadia Gaon was a 7th century leader of the Jewish people in exile in Babylon. Explaining the statement, explaining why Hashem's name is absent from the Megillah. So here's one of the biggest questions about the Megillah. Reb Sadia says that the original text of the Megillah was commissioned by Achashverosh and written by Mordechai, I assume with Esther, for the purpose of recording secular Persian history. Mordechai feared that the librarians of the Persian annals would substitute Hashem's name for their own Persian deities, and so he left God's name out entirely. What's mind-blowing, says Rabbi Kropkin in this, is that according to this, the Megillah started as a secular Persian text and was later adopted and canonized as part of Tanakh. I'm not aware of any other examples of this, are you? Here's the text from the Otzar HaGa'anim Masechtas Megillah. Just hide it, hold it up. Hopefully you can. Wait a second. I want to thank Rabbi Kropkin for passing this on to us because it's tremendously significant. Rav Sadia's explanation about why God's name is not in the Megillah goes way beyond the issue of the Megillah. I have held personally for a very long time that it's important, very important, to read Tanakh from the perspective of when it was written. Now, what I'm going to tell you does not reflect negatively in any way on the work of the prophets or the writings or their holy connection with God as prophecy or as inspired writings. And what I'm going to say does not apply to the first 5 books of Tanakh, right? They're called often the 5 books of Moses, but does apply to the prophets and the writings. The Jewish history is one that's drenched in persecution and blood. And so, when we suffer persecution and we want to record the events, it's a very dangerous thing to do. Think North Korea. Think Stalin, right? Makshamo, think any of the modern enemies of the Jews or even of their own people. those who take on the position of resistance endanger their lives and the lives of their loved ones. What they are writing when they write in resistance is a document that for sure will cause them to be tortured and eventually killed, if found out. And so much of the writings, whether it's written under a corrupt Jewish king or under Greek or Persian or Roman, or for that matter, the church itself, under that persecution, needs to be written in a way that conveys the message to the reader, and yet to the person who is not Jewish and is part of the persecutors, they don't clue into what it is. And so it's very important to read documents, whether it's Yirmiyahu's writing or the writings that were written in the Persian or Roman exiles. It's very important to read them in the context of the author's life. Now, the fact that it's inspired by God himself does not lessen what I'm saying, but actually increases it. Because only with the super intelligence beyond that of man himself, humankind, without that, it would be impossible to embed into the Tanakh two sets of lessons. Let me give you kind of an example and understand that this is lahavdil. But there are certain news shows today that are comedies. You know, Jon Stewart's program was one like it. It had a lot of very serious elements in its comedy. But if you were to watch Jon Stewart's shows out of context 2,000 years from now, you wouldn't know it was comedy. You would think it was the news of the day. When we read the story, the Purim story, when we read the history of the Omer, when we read large parts of Jewish history, we're reading documents that were written in secret, documents that were preserved, and documents that for the authors, they knew that their audience would understand it all, but their persecutors would not. A small example. We understand that the students of Rabbi Akiva, 24,000 were killed during the Omer. Terrible. They were killed out of disrespect? Really? Well, there's another credible source that says they were hunted down and killed by the Romans. Rabbi Akiva was the spiritual leader of the Bar Kokhba revolt. But if you had written that they were killed because of the brutality of the Romans, and the Romans got you, you would be cut up into very small pieces. So better to word it this way. Now, the readers at the time understood what it meant. The Romans accepted it as an explanation. But when we read it 2,000 years later, we took the Romans out of the story and what they were doing completely. There are things missing from our story that are very hard to explain. So let me come back to one of the most interesting ones for me. Remember when Mordechai says, if you don't do this, go to the king, the Jews will be saved, but you'll be disgraced? There's two more parts to this whole thing. Towards the end of the story, Haman is killed. But the edict that the king has signed has already gone out. And so Esther and Mordechai come to the king and they say, look, we're really happy that you've done the right thing here and that Haman is dead. But by the way, my people could be killed this year. So what happens? Let's see. When they come to the king, they say, please take the edict back, right? If I have found favor before you, and the idea is fitting to the king, I am good in his eyes. Let an order be written to withdraw the letters written by Haman ben Hammedatha the Agagite, containing the plot to exterminate the Jews who are in all the king's provinces. For how can I possibly watch the tragedy befall my people? How can I bear to look at the destruction of my heritage? She's pleading to take back the edict. King Ahasuerus replied to Queen Esther and to Mordechai the Jew, look, I've given Haman's estate to Esther, and they've hanged him on the gallows because he attempted to harm the Jews. You may write an amendment about the Jews as you see fit in the name of the king, my name, and seal it with the king's ring. For an order that has already been written with the king's name and sealed with the king's signature cannot be revoked. So look, you want to write a document about the Jews, right? Go right ahead. But you can't revoke something written by a Persian emperor. It's not done. We'll deal with that question at a future date, but this is the statement in the Megillah. So what happens? They don't protest. They accept that that's what it is, and they begin immediately, it says, to work on another document. Mordechai sent out letters by mounted couriers, riders, and royal stock of swift camels bred from dromedaries, that the king had granted the Jews in every city permission to gather and defend their lives. If any people or province incites them, they may destroy, kill, exterminate in its armed force, children, women, take their possessions for plunder. On a single day, in the provinces of King Ahasuerus, the 13th day of the month of Adar, the 12th month. So, on the day that Haman had decided the Jews should be exterminated, a counter edict is sent that says the Jews have permission to defend themselves. You may be hearing the muezzin in the background, the call to prayer. So this is sent out to all the people who received Haman's. Well, who were the Jews? Right? The Jews were the people of the southern kingdom. There was another group of people. Today in Central Asia, when you ask somebody who is a descendant of the 10 tribes, are you Jewish? They say no. Bani Yisrael. We are from the house of Israel, of the 10 tribes. They were also taken into captivity by the Assyrians. But the Assyrians, according to their own records, didn't mix them with other populations, because the Israelite charioteers were among the most feared fighting force in the ancient world. And so the Assyrians kept them separate and kept them as border guards along the borders of the Assyrian Empire. We don't know this for sure, but it seems very possible that generations after generations they remained in this position as the empires moved from Assyria to Babylon and eventually Media and then Persia. Could it be that what was required was the assistance now of our cousins, the cousins of the Jews, the descendants of the southern kingdom of Judah, the Israelite charioteers. I would argue that's exactly what it was. And I would argue it because they were going up against a trained Amalekite militia. The Jews of Shushan, as described, are merchants, they're businessmen, they're bureaucrats. No mention of them as warriors at all. But what happened at the end? The Jews of Shushan gathered on the 14th day of Adar as well, and they killed 300 men in Shushan. But they did not take the plunder, which they were allowed to do. Now listen to this carefully. The rest of the Jews in the king's provinces, gathered and mobilized themselves, ridding themselves of their enemies. They killed 75,000 of their rivals, but they did not take their plunder. This was in one day. 75,000 armed militia were killed by the gathering of the Jews. I would argue that Mordechai, through the edict that the Jews could defend themselves, could go to the Israelite charioteers and say, we need you now. We will be destroyed and you will also be destroyed. And the king has given you permission to leave the barracks and defend us. Because killing 3,000 people an hour without guns in the ancient world is not something that scholars can do. Only trained warriors can do it. And who were these people? It doesn't say that the people who are now afraid of Mordechai joined the Jews. It says the Jews. Number 2, gifts to the poor. Right? It's very important. Matanas Avoyim is to give gifts of money to those who are in need. Number 3, Shalach Manot. Right? Send gifts of food to those who you love, family and friends. Remind them of the bond between you. You can even use it to make friends from people who you've become estranged from. And end Purim with a su'udah, a gathering, a meal of tremendous joy and celebration with those, obviously, that you want to share that joy and celebration with. They are all events that share one thing in common: achdus, unity. This is a request that Esther and Mordechai are talking about, unity. Could it be that moment of unity that we knew at Sinai, we knew at Purim, God willing, we'll know at the coming of Mashiach, when the temple is rebuilt? I want to wish you all, when all the tribes are once again together, I want to wish you all a Freyok, a happy Purim, the best to you. And now I'm off to Mincha. Enjoy your Purim, enjoy your loved ones, fulfill the mitzvahs, think about all this. With best regards to all of my friends in New York, in Toronto, and of course here in Carmiel. Freyok Purim.